Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Combs, and in this video, I would like to talk about arguing to persuade. Now, we have finished Essay 1, and we were arguing to inform in Essay 1, but now we're going to switch gears a little bit and argue to persuade. So, the first thing I want to say is that some people do not distinguish between argumentation and persuasion. They say every argument is an argument to persuade. And that's fine if you want to feel that way. However, I don't. I think that when you're arguing to persuade, you're doing something different from merely providing readers with information they may not know, when you argue to inform. Lunsford and Rakiziwig, and remember, I'm not very good at pronouncing last names, so I'm probably butchering that every time I say it. But they put it this way. They say writers of persuasive arguments unabashedly want to move audiences enough to provoke action. So you're not just providing information here. You are wanting your audience to do something after they read your argument. Lunsford and Rakiziwig also state, when you argue to persuade, you not only convince audiences, but move them to action. We just said that before. Whether that involves buying a product, voting for a candidate, or supporting a policy. So the action doesn't have to be very large. So if you're writing an argument where you're talking about maybe missionary work or joining some organization that provides care in emergencies, maybe like the Red Cross. You don't want to. You're not necessarily telling your readers, go and join the Red Cross or sign up for the Peace Corps, right? What you're doing is you might want them to change their views, or you might want them to donate. So it doesn't always have to be a large action, but you do want to move them to some action. And Knieving and Warner, they state that the action you want from your audience may simply be a change of mind. So it doesn't have to be a big change, but you do want to cause some change, or you strive to cause some change in your audience when you argue to persuade. So audience is important when you argue to persuade. And the reason why audience is so important is because you will often, when arguing to persuade, be addressing those who oppose your view. So it is important to pay close attention to your audience. And according to Knieving and Warner, you need to explore their interests and concerns by looking for answers to some crucial questions. And I have some questions listed here. So you want to know how much your audience knows about the topic you're writing about. You may need to provide some background information that your audience may or may not know. You also want to know what points you agree with your audience on. So if you're writing about something that you expect others to disagree with you, it's good to know what exactly you and your opponents agree on. So very rarely do you try to convince someone that totally disagrees with you. There's usually some common ground. So what you want to do is explore those and make sure you refer to those in your argument, in your essay, because that will establish common ground. It will show your audience where you're coming from. Okay, so even though we differ on these main points, we do start at the same place, or we do start from similar viewpoints. We just differ in the way we view particular issues. Also, you want to think about those points where you and your readers do differ, and you want to think about why your readers might believe the way they do. I can remember that when I first started working at the college, I was talking to a coworker, and we were talking about troops being sent to the Middle East, and she sort of abruptly said something like, I just want them to go in there and just bomb them all and then get it over with. And I thought, oh my Lord. And I was talking to another colleague and I was like, can you believe that she said that? And the other colleague said, well, her son is stationed in Iraq and has been there for a long time. And so if I were going to write about how she thinks that troops need to withdraw or that we don't need to be in the Middle East at that point, um, this was soon after uh, the attack on the World Trade Center. I think it was 2002. If I was saying that I thought we should be involved in the politics and um, the whatever military, we should have military presence in the Middle East, and she doesn't think so. Well, I need to consider the fact that the reason why she doesn't think so is because she has a personal stake in it, in that her son is there, right? So I need to consider that. Now, that doesn't make me believe like she did that let's go in there and do something drastic to end it quickly and bring the troops home. I feel like, I felt at that time like we could find a solution that didn't involve, you know, um, a lot of innocent people getting hurt, possibly. But I do need to know where my audience is coming from so that I can tailor my argument to address the topics that are most interesting to my reader. Another question is, what arguments will readers use to oppose your view? And what beliefs and values do your readers have? So, persuading your audience to change their beliefs or to act on them is a tough job. And we don't want to forego logos, pathos, and ethos here. It isn't easy, Knievy and Warner say, to get people to change their minds. So the evidence you present and the way you present it are both very important. Logos, pathos, and ethos, or appeals to logic, emotion, and character, are all vital tools when persuading your audience. So we've talked about those in other videos. So I'm not going to go over those again. You can refer to those other videos if you need to. But just like you used appeals to logic, emotion, and character in arguing to inform, when you argue to persuade, those techniques are even more important. So I will say something about using character or appealing to character. So a note about using ethos when arguing to persuade. You want to demonstrate that you are a reasonable person by establishing common ground with the reader, showing the reader that even if you differ, for example, if you differ on how you feel about abortion, for example, then you might want to start out with some things that everyone agrees on, or that you think everybody agrees on about pregnancy and women's bodies, and then go from there. If you want to talk about, for example, whether or not we should have marriage equality, then you need to start out with some things that people, if you are in favor of marriage equality, then you need to start out with some people who feel like marriage is between a man and a woman only. You want to share some common ground with those people first, and then branch out and say, look, we're both coming from the same place, but here's how I interpret um, that place that we're coming from. Here's how I interpret our shared values that shows me that that I support this. And even though you may, with those same values that I have come to a different conclusion, we both have started out at the same place. That's a very good persuasive technique. It shows that you're not just some crazy person who has crazy ideas, that you actually come from the same place as your audience who may or may not agree with your stance. And it also shows that you are trying to connect and not just saying that your audience is stupid or totally wrong, that you understand where they're coming from, but think about it like this for a change. So, and that goes right into my second point here. Never sound like you are attacking those who disagree with you. Always be respectful, always be calm, be very passionate, but always be respectful and calm. And never use, and I say never, as I ask you not to use never. So do not use words like always and never, but use conciliatory language such as in many cases, it may seem that, or much of the time, instead of saying always or never, because nothing is always or never. Life is a little more complex than that. So for example, let's say that I wanted to make the statement, educational funding is always cut when we have a Republican governor in Kentucky. Well, now that may or may not be the case, but people who are Republicans or support Republican political candidates, I'm turning them off right there, because they may, first of all, they may just stop listening, or secondly, they may know of some instances where, wait a minute, we had such and such Republican governor and money was given to education, funding was not cut. So what I might want to say is many Republican governors have not supported education. So unless that's just a lie, my readers will have a harder time refuting that or going against that, especially if when I say that, I give a few examples to let them know, right? So always and never, those are not good words to use. Use things like in many cases, or it may seem. In many cases, I like that the best because, what is many cases, right? You can cite 3 or 4 cases and you've proven that in many cases this has happened, right? So use those words rather than always or never. And then again, treat your reader with respect by refraining from making them feel stupid. Never use phrases such as obviously or as anyone can see, because there are very smart people who some things that are obvious to you are not obvious to them. So I would not use things like obviously or as anyone can see. Now, here is the big thing with arguing to persuade. One of the best ways, and probably the best way, to persuade your readers is to explicitly deal with counter-arguments. Counter-arguments are arguments that are opposed to yours. If I say that I think that marriage should be between any 2 people who love each other, so I want there to be marriage equality, then the opposing view or the counter argument is marriage should be between only a man and a woman. If I think that women should have the right to choose whether or not to have an abortion, then the counter argument is there should be laws banning abortion. So according to Kersner and Mandel, a writer should summarize opposing arguments accurately and explain why these arguments are weak, untrue, unimportant, or irrelevant. Be careful not to oversimplify an opposing argument, however, to make it easier to refute. This is one of the hardest things to do when you're arguing to persuade. It's very hard to list fair evidence that goes against what you're arguing and then have counter arguments or arguments against your counter arguments that bring your reader back and say, okay, well, this person has dealt with those things or those arguers who are opposed to their view, but look, they've come back with they're answering it. They're telling me this is why, this evidence doesn't hold up. This is why this evidence doesn't hold up. So refutation is not easy to do, but it is very effective. It is very effective when you're arguing to persuade. So I have a few guidelines for you. So ways to approach refutation. So when you refute, you list someone's opposing argument and you explain the flaws in that person's thinking. So there are several approaches you can take to refuting opposing arguments. And what I've done here is I've explained the approach a little bit, and then I've given you some templates that you can sort of modify and insert this language into your essay when you're dealing with opposing arguments. So, for example, one way that you can approach a refutation is you can concede, which means admit that they're true. You can concede some of the opposing views, but then challenging the importance or usefulness of these views. So you can say something like, indeed, some of the points are valid. However, this information does not apply in this situation because, and then you can explain why, okay, well, these points are valid, but here's why my argument is different, or here's why they don't apply to my argument. You could also say something like, while I do agree that such and such is true, it is more important to consider such and such, okay? So if your opposing arguments or the people who have opposed your view as you do your research, if they use the same evidence that you use, but they interpret it differently, then you can explain why a reader should not accept their interpretation. You might say something like, while my opponent has interpreted this statistic as blank, it actually shows blank. Or by focusing on this, my opponent has overlooked the more significant problem of whatever, right? And you can fill in these with particulars. Or again, while it is true that, it does not necessarily follow that this. So they have cited some evidence that is true, but that's really not supporting their view the way they think it is. Okay, that's a good approach. All right, if the opposing view contains different evidence than you have used, so if your counter arguments have used different evidence, then you can explain why you can explain why the reader should not accept the evidence of your opponent. And you can show the opposing evidence is inaccurate, the claim that blank rests upon the questionable assumption that blank, so that the evidence they're using is not accurate, it's not true, the facts are not correct. You can choose to show that the evidence is insufficient. So by focusing on blank, X has overlooked the more significant problem of blank, right? You can show that the evidence is unrelated to the topic. While it is true that, it does not necessarily follow that. We've looked at that template before. You can show that the evidence is cherry-picked. So when an opponent has cherry-picked evidence, what they have done is they have ignored well-known evidence that goes against their view. So you might say something like, whereas my opponent has provided evidence that blank, Y and Z's research on this and this convinces me this instead, right? So, that's showing that they have left out some evidence that goes against their view. You may also show that the evidence is out of date. This may have been true in the past, but recent research has shown. And you can also show that the evidence is from a source that is not credible. My opponent has said blank, but this may better be able to speak to the topic at hand. So as you're writing your essay and you need to address counter arguments, go back to these templates, use them. You don't have to use them word for word like they are here, but sort of use them and modify them as needed. So here are a couple examples of refutation. What I would like for you to do is take a few moments, read through these, and see if you can identify what approach to the refutation these examples use, and talk a little bit about the effectiveness of these paragraphs dealing with counter arguments. So I'll give you a moment to do that. Okay, let's continue on. So the first one talks about using animals as test subjects for beauty products. So the thesis is about beauty products, but they first say some people argue that using animals as test subjects for health products is justifiable. To be fair, animal testing has been used in the past to aid the development of several vaccines, such as smallpox and rabies. However, animal testing for beauty products causes unneeded pain to animals. So, hear what they're saying when they refute the counter argument. The counter argument is, well, some animal testing, has been helpful, right? Animal testing is helpful to humans. Think about these health products. Well, the person who is writing this argument is saying, okay, yes, I see that. I can see that. To be fair, animal testing has been used to develop vaccines. However, we're talking about beauty products. So I see this, if we can go back here, as as number one, maybe. And some of these might fall into, a couple different categories, but I totally see this as the first approach that we talked about. You can concede some of the opposing views. Okay, I'll give it to you. I don't like it, but animal testing has been helpful in health research. And that doesn't apply here because we're talking about beauty research, right? All right, let's look at the next one. And also, I think this is pretty effective. So, admittedly, the next paragraph says many students would like to smoke on campus. Some people may rightly argue that if smoking on campus is not illegal, then it should be permitted. Okay, so that's the counter argument. Smoking on campus, there's not any laws against it at the state or federal level, so it should be permitted. However, secondhand smoke may cause harm to those who have health issues like asthma, possibly putting them at risk. Okay, so let's see. I'm thinking that this is a use of different evidence because the counter argument is focusing on what you have the right to do, and the argument, the rebuttal, I guess, that this writer is using is focusing on what it is right to do based on how your behavior affects other human beings. So I'm thinking maybe it's this third view that we talked about, and maybe it's an unrelated. While it is true that it's not illegal to smoke on campus, it still shouldn't be allowed because it's a health risk for everyone, right? Or you could say this is cherry-picked, where my opponent has provided evidence that shows that it's legal to smoke on campus. My opponent has ignored the evidence that shows how unhealthy it is. Oh, I'm sorry, wrong way. And so that, I think, maybe is a good strong refutation as well. So as you're writing your own essay and you go to look at counter arguments, look back at these two paragraphs. So organizing the persuasive argument. Pay special attention to the arrangement of your lines of argument, the reasons you use to support your thesis. So that's what your lines of argument are. Consider this advice from Aaron. Unless the reasons form a chain, so you may have reasons where one reason follows from the other one, and you need to keep them in order because of that. So if that's not happening, then the order of your reasons should be determined by their potential effect on the readers. In general, it is most effective to arrange the reasons in order of increasing importance or strength as to finish powerfully. So, something that's not as convincing, then something is a little more convincing, and use your most convincing argument or your most convincing point last, so it's fresher in the reader's mind. But on the other hand, you may want to engage readers from the start. So you may want to begin with a really strong reason to show readers, this is the power of my argument right here. This is a powerful point that I'm making. So to engage the readers from the start, you might try to begin with a reason they will find compelling or that they already know and accept. That way, the weaker reasons will be sandwiched between a strong beginning and an even stronger ending. So keep that in mind. Now, how can I organize a persuasive argument? Well, one way is to use the classic oration pattern, and this was the pattern used by ancient Greek and Roman orators or speech makers for presenting cases in court and presenting speeches to the Senate. So an introduction first does all the things that an introduction should do. It gains the reader's attention, establishes the writer's ability to talk about the subject. Establishing your ethos is important. Establishes common ground with the audience. We're coming from the same place. Our views just happen to be a little bit different. Demonstrates the writer is fair and reasonable and states the thesis. Then you have another paragraph or few paragraphs that where you present some background. So you may need to talk about, why is this argument important now? What are the things you need to know to understand my particular take on this argument? So presents information needed for understanding the argument, puts the argument in some context. Then your lines of argument. So you give your reasons that you believe your argument is true, reasons and evidence, logical and emotional appeals. Then after that, you spend a little bit of time giving alternative arguments. This is where you rebut. This is where the refutation comes in, or the rebuttal. Examines alternate points of view and opposing viewpoints respectfully, notes advantages and disadvantages to these views, and you ultimately want to explain why the writer's view is better than others, and you do that by using one of these patterns that we talked about, okay? So look to these as you explain why your view is better. And in fact, you don't have to use any of the language here. If you have a different way that you would like to word something, that's totally fine. But look to these approaches as you are struggling or as you need a little bit of guidance. And then finally, a conclusion summarizes the argument, elaborates on implications of argument, makes clear what you want the audience to think or do, calls the audience to action, reinforces your credibility, can offer an emotional appeal if you would like. So this is the general pattern that I would like for your essays to follow. Now, there's no restriction as far as how many paragraphs or how many words or whatever, but this is the general pattern, I think. Now, what you want to do in a persuasive essay is you want to try to limit bias as much as possible. And this is almost impossible to do because we are all biased, even if we don't like to admit it. And our biases, you really have to work to overcome bias, because it's something that most of the time just feels natural to us, right? It just sort of feels like it's a natural way that we feel. But Kerzner and Mandel define bias as a writer's use of preconceived ideas rather than factual evidence as support for his or her arguments. So you do not want to just say, well, I know this about every woman who would consider getting an abortion. I know this and I'm using it in my argument. No, what you want to do is you want to use facts and statistics to describe women who have had or are willing to have an abortion. Writers who exhibit bias may attempt to manipulate sources so they fit their purpose rather than representing those sources accurately. As a writer, you should strive to write without bias. Also, you should refrain from using evidence from sources that exhibit bias, and we'll talk more about evaluating sources in a later video. So let's use the following guidelines to detect bias and then try not to use that. Look for explicit statements of the writer's beliefs and determine whether the writer allows those to downplay or emphasize certain viewpoints unfairly. Look for slanted language, and slanted language is sort of language that is not objective. So if I refer to, in my essay, if I refer to same-sex couples as those perverts, well, that's slanted language, because that may be the way some people feel, but other people don't feel that way. So that's not really objective language. Look to see how the writer deals with opposing viewpoints. If the writer has attacked those who view things differently than they do, then you might not want to use that essay or use that article or use that chapter in your argument. And again, as you are dealing with opposing viewpoints, always be very respectful. Consider the tone of the argument and look for overtly offensive language. Words that we usually do not say in polite society. If those are in the argument probably is biased. So when arguing to persuade, you want to watch out for something called propaganda. And propaganda is writing that sets out to persuade at all costs, abandoning reason, fairness, and truth altogether. And here lately, well, since the invention of Facebook, propaganda is rampant. So it is not hard for you to find propaganda everywhere. And in fact, a couple of these things I have found on Facebook. I'm going to show you some examples of propaganda. So let's look at some examples of propaganda here. So back in this first one right here, I don't know if it was actually a book cover or if it was just a poster that was made to look like a book. But back in the 1950s, there was a fear that communism was going to take over America. And if you had to read in high school The Crucible, which was about the Salem witch trials, well, it was explicitly about the Salem witch trials, but Arthur Miller wrote it to be a comment on the Red Scare, or the scare of communism. They called it the Red Scare. So this shows you what will happen in America if communists take over. Apparently, women will be whipped and chained, and people will be shooting people, and it can happen here. That's fear, right? So this is playing on our emotion of fear, and I mean, you're giving up on reason. I mean, just because a certain political party takes over or gains power, not really takes over, I don't know why I said that, but just because a certain political party or a certain ideology gains power or becomes widespread, it doesn't mean that, women will be whipped and soldiers will be shot. So, propaganda. The next image we have here is an image of Barack Obama with Heath Ledger's Joker character makeup on, and beneath it is just characteristics of a psychopath. So, psychopath, incapable of authentic deep emotion, feels breaking promises and agreements is normal behavior. So whether or not you feel that way about Barack Obama, I would classify this as propaganda, because I don't have any factual evidence here. All I've done is taken characteristics of a psychopath and put Barack Obama's picture above it. So I've not really done my homework to show why Barack Obama is a psychopath. And that's where propaganda comes in. I've abandoned reason. I'm not using logical appeals. I'm just trying to focus only on emotional appeals here. And it's another scare tactic, right? Barack Obama must be a psychopath. I've depicted him wearing the Joker's makeup, and I've put him a picture of him above the word psychopath, so he must be a psychopath. Well, that's really illogical. That doesn't that really doesn't follow logically, right? So that is propaganda. And then the last one, which I love, is from PETA, and the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And PETA is just wacko sometimes. And again, I'm not being very respectful about PETA. And so I would never say, I'm going to say that to you all because that's my personal belief, but I would never write PETA is wacko in an argument for the academic community, because that is not treating the opponents to my views with respect. But this is sort of I don't know if it's like I said, if it's a poster or if it was an actual comic book, but yeah, I guess it's for little kids, and it says your daddy kills animals just because he's a fisherman. And I mean, fishermen are not all about killing animals. What if you're fishing to eat? Or what if you fish and throw them back? So this is definitely propaganda. It has, if you remember, I'm going to go back here. Propaganda is writing that sets out to persuade at all costs. So this is trying to persuade me not to be a fisherman by convincing me that if I'm a fisherman, then I love killing animals and gutting them. And I mean, this fish down here is sort of in pain, and you may be fishing to feed your family. You may be fishing because you want to exert that skill, and you may be throwing the fish back, right? Or you may not, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're a killer, or you love the kill. There are plenty of other reasons why you might fish. Okay, and so I'm going to go back to the definition. So you want to persuade at all costs, abandoning reason, fairness, and truth altogether. So we've definitely, in these three, abandoned reason and fairness. So you do not want to argue using propaganda. So here are some tips for avoiding propaganda. Avoid the following. Do not distort evidence. Do not present opposing views inaccurately or exaggerate them. So, for example, I wouldn't want to say the dean's concern about the cost of the campus going green. The dean's concerns, about the cost of the campus going green reveal that he has no interest in sustaining life on planet Earth. Well, that's not necessarily true. Maybe the dean doesn't care about life on planet Earth, but it's more likely that the dean realizes that money is tight on a college campus, and the dean has to make decisions very carefully. So instead of saying that, you might say, the dean expresses concern about the cost of going green, but the long-term benefits justify the expense. So you're saying, okay, so the dean is cautious here, but I'm still in support of this because even though it may be expensive, the benefits will justify that. Instead of just distorting really what the dean says to make your point seem more valid. Do not quote out of context. So do not take words out of the original setting in which they appeared. So if the dean says, for schools with limited resources, it may be more important to allocate funds to academic programs than to environmental projects, it is unfair for you to say, according to the dean, it is more important to allocate funds to academic programs than to environmental projects. That's unfair because you did not list the context as well. Since that is not the whole truth, so that's unfair because it's not the whole truth. The dean stated that academic programs are more important when there is limited funding. If we had enough funding, the dean might be in favor of supporting both academics and environmental projects. But you have a college or a school with limited resources here. So you're also going to avoid slanting evidence. Slanting is choosing only evidence that supports your opinion and ignoring evidence that challenge it, or using biased language to unfairly characterize your opponents or their positions. So the way that you're going to not slant evidence is you're going to, in Essay 2 and Essay 3 and 4, always consider opposing viewpoints, okay? So from here on out, you're going to make your arguments stronger by considering counter arguments and opposing those. And then also do not use biased language. So, for example, don't claim that all supporters of the death penalty have no respect for human life or call a concerned environmentalist a tree hugger, right? You know, maybe some people who support the death penalty do have respect for human life, but they feel so passionately about some crimes that they are willing to allow taking of life as a punishment for those crimes, right? So you don't, I mean, you know, when you use slanting evidence, you sort of assume, you don't really let the facts guide you. Again, you let your preconceived notions guide you. And also, don't make unfair appeals. Do not try to scare your audience or appeal to prejudice that they might have. So do not say construction projects that do not use green materials doom future generations to a planet that cannot sustain itself. This is an appeal to fear rather than rational thought. There's a better way that you can say that. All right. So I hope that this has given you some ideas as you begin to think about what you might or how you might use arguing to persuade. And we will very soon start doing some pre-writing activities to get us started on Essay 2. So I hope you found this helpful, and until next time, I will see you.